it is just proof that metal music is absolutely gorgeous. Hi everyone, and welcome back to my channel. I'm Molly, and in this video I'm going to be ranking all of the albums from the French heavy metal band Gojira. So a couple of weeks ago I put a poll on my community tab here on YouTube, and I asked which artist or band you guys wanted me to do a ranking for next, and by a pretty wide margin I would say Gojira took the top place. So I figured I would go through, listen to all of Gojira's albums, and do a little ranking video for you guys, and kind of just give my thoughts and opinions on their albums and what I thought of each one. So yeah, hopefully you all enjoy this video, and let's get on into the ranking. Alright, so first, just my quick little rundown of my ranking system. A+ are the albums that I think are essentially perfection. A are the albums that are very close to perfection. There's maybe like just a few things where they fall short, but they're really, really good. B are solid albums. I thoroughly enjoyed them. They're not necessarily my favorites from the artist, but they're really good still. C are albums that kind of just fade away into the background, not super memorable. And then D are just the albums I did not get into, I was not a fan of overall. Alright, so we are starting out with Terra Incognita. This is Gojira's debut studio album, and it came out in 2001. And overall, this album had a great sound to it. I really liked how it incorporates a lot of kind of natural sounding elements with like the really heavy, intense metal instrumentals and vocals. And I kind of found that trend across most of Gojira's albums. They kind of do that, but I think it was the most prominent on their first album, Terra Incognita. I also just really liked all of the change-ups in the tempo and the rhythm. Like there's just a lot of sonic tricks that they do to kind of change it up a little bit. Even like within one track, the sound can change completely, which I found really entertaining as a listener. Lizard Skin is a track that is a great example of this, just with the tempo change. They completely change up the sound of this song, and it just is cool to listen to. And then you have the instrumental track 04, which is a great example again of how they change it up on this album. You can go from crazy intense songs, and then you have just really organic, natural sounding ones like 04. I will say there's a couple of tracks on here for me that fall a little bit short. 1990 Quadrillions de Tons is one of them. I wasn't really sure about all of the shrieking and like the wailing going on this one, but it is still a really good album overall, and I think I'm going to be putting Terra Incognita in B. It's not an amazing album, but it's not a bad album. It's like right in the middle for me. Up next is Gojira's 2003 album, The Link. This one was also kind of interesting. I'm not really sure how I felt about this one. I started listening to it, and I will be honest, really didn't get into it. Like the first half of this album, I just was not really vibing with. But then toward the end, it did start to grow on me. It has the same structure as their first album, Terra Incognita, with the whole like shorter interludes that are more calming, natural, organic sounds, but then they switch it up with the main, like the longer running tracks that are just these bombastic, crazy intense, manic songs with fantastic instrumentals going on. But the difference between The Link and their first album for me was just the tracks kind of blended together more. There wasn't any that really stood out. I found on Terra Incognita there were moments where they threw in some variety or some change-ups that just made it a really interesting album to listen to, and I didn't get that on The Link. I don't know, it just kind of missed the mark for me. I will say the track Indians, I thought the vocal inflections on this one were kind of cool, and I did really like the track Inward Movement. I think this was my favorite song on The Link. I feel really torn on this one. I'm between C and D. I think I'm gonna put The Link in D. That might be a little bit harsh. I don't know. It just didn't do it for me. It wasn't my favorite album. Up next is Gojira's album From Mars to Sirius, and this one came out in 2005. This album's got some crazy energy going on. I mean, every Gojira album does, but this is yet another example of how awesome their sound is. Just the tracks run together really well. It works really good as an album just because sonically, like one track just flows into the next extremely well, better than it does on their first two albums. The track running times on this album too are a little bit longer, and we have less of those shorter instrumental kind of organic sounding interludes. There is one track though, Unicorn, that is shorter. It's like I think around 2 minutes long. That's an instrumental one, and there's some cool whale sounds that it uses. It's just sonically a really unique song. Backbone was also a huge standout for me on this album. Just how heavy and intense the instrumentals go on that track are great. Flying Whales, just how this song kind of starts so organically with the whale sounds and it just grows from there and takes off completely. And Global Warming too is another favorite. That one really stood out to me. There's something really compelling about its sound, and the guitar was just fantastic on this track. I really liked it. So from Mars to Sirius, this is another one I am torn on. I'm so torn on this one. At certain times, it just was a tiny bit long-winded for me, but it's a great album, and there were many tracks on it that I really got into. I think I'm going to put it at the top of B. I will put it ahead of their debut album, but it's very close to an A. I guess I was just looking for a tiny little bit more like variety or something to spice it up just a little bit more, but it's really good. I did thoroughly enjoy this one. Up next, we have Gojira's 2008 album, The Way of All Flesh. This one has a great, just intense, dark, dramatic sound to it. I also noticed less of those kind of natural, earthy sounds on this one. The Way of All Flesh is almost the opposite of how I reacted to Gojira's album, The Link. So with The Link, the beginning, I wasn't really getting into it, and then the end, it grew on me a little bit. The Way of All Flesh is the opposite. So at the start, I loved this album. I really enjoyed the sound of it. And then toward the end, it just kind of lost its appeal a little bit. I found its running time to be a little bit too long. The tracks too all kind of blend together as well. And then the last track on this album too, they went and they added a hidden track, which I'm really not a huge fan of hidden tracks, and it just, in my opinion, it just made the runtime of this album longer than it needed to be. There are a couple of standout tracks though on this album. Like I said, the beginning, I actually really got into. I kind of was enjoying it. Toxic Garbage Island was one that I really got into, and the vocals on this one are crazy. And A Sight to Behold, was it synths that they were using on this track? Because that's kind of what it sounded like to me. But it just had an electronic sound. It was a little bit different. That's kind of what I wanted more of on this album, just more variety, things kind of changing up the sound a bit. And we got that on a few tracks, but just toward the end, it just got too long-winded for my taste. So I think The Way of All Flesh, I did enjoy this album more than The Link. However, it's not on par with Terra Incognita or From Mars to Sirius, for me anyway. So I think I'm going to put it in C. I'm going to put it right there. So up next is Gojira's 2012 album L'Enfant Sauvage, and this one is awesome. I thoroughly enjoyed myself listening to this one. There's a great flow between the tracks and fantastic cohesion, yet there's also enough variety to keep things interesting, which is kind of an issue I've had with a couple of Gojira's albums, is I've wanted more variety. This album is kind of like The Way of All Flesh in that it uses more of that kind of electronic stuff. There's less kind of natural earthy tones on this one, and we still have all of that aggressive, intense Gojira energy, but they do some interesting sonic things that keep you on your toes. As a listener, it keeps you involved, and I really appreciate that. Explosia is a great start to this album, very appropriate track title. It just is like an explosion of energy just to get this album going. Liquid Fire was definitely one of my favorites on this album, just with those cool vocal distortions. It really stood out to me. And The Gift of Guilt with those electronic elements going on. Again, it just kind of changed this album up. It threw in some new sounds. So, L'Enfant Sauvage, this one I'm torn on. It's such a great album. I don't think it's quite A+ for me, but it is really good. I just enjoyed listening to it. It's very entertaining. I am going to put L'Enfant Sauvage in A. Up next is Gojira's 2016 album Magma. I found this one to be very cinematic sounding, just these big sweeping sounds that completely envelop you. The tracks on this one are so cohesive and they just flow really well. And again, like I said about the previous album, they keep you as a listener really engaged by throwing in a lot of different elements and just changing it up to kind of keep the tracks interesting and give you new sounds to digest. But overall, Magma, I think it's just almost more restrained than some of their previous albums. It kind of has a more, like I said, cinematic sound to it. The vocals too are more kind of natural singing, less of that intense screaming going on. And Magma, honestly, just no skips from start to finish. This album was awesome. I absolutely loved it. Right out of the gate, we have The Shooting Star, great example of that cinematic sound I was talking about. Just such a big, epic song and a great start to this album. Silvera and The Cell, just the energy that these tracks bring is so impressive. And my favorite track on Magma, and this is my favorite Gojira track, to be honest, is Stranded. This song is so beautiful. To anyone who completely rules out metal music because they think it's just loud screaming and they don't really give it a chance, have them listen to Stranded by Gojira, because it is just proof that metal music is absolutely gorgeous, and it's melodic, but it's also intense. It's just an absolutely gorgeous song. So Magma, I loved this album. I'm going to put Magma in A+. Alright, so last up is Fortitude. This is Gojira's most recent album, and it actually was released this year in 2021. And this album, I think it's a great crossover between L'Enfant Sauvage and Magma. It kind of has sounds similar to both of those albums. The vocals, again, are a little more restrained, kind of like what they did on Magma. So their earlier albums, Gojira kind of embraces the more metal sound with their vocals and everything. And then their three most recent albums, but I think especially on Magma and Fortitude, they kind of rein their vocals in a little bit more. They have more melodic moments that shine through, which I don't really know if I have a preference, to be honest, but again, it just kind of adds more of that change up throughout the album. You have some really intense vocals, but then you have more restrained ones too. Amazonia is a really cool track on Fortitude with just I think it's the didgeridoo that they use, and there's some flute on there. It kind of gives it almost like a tribal feeling, and it's kind of incorporating like what they did on their earlier albums with those organic sounding interludes. They're kind of doing that on their later albums too, only they're tying it into like the main tracks. Another World has some great drums, and it almost has a very angelic sounding ending. It's just a really beautiful track. Into the Storm, I think, is one of my favorites. Just the instrumentals on this one are insane. And the track Grind, I think they use some synths on this one. Just a great example of how Gojira, again, just ties in all of these different sounds, but yet they make a really cohesive album too. It's not like they're just throwing everything into one album. They make it matter. They tie everything together. I think Fortitude, for me, is going to go in A, and I think, honestly, Fortitude and L'Enfant Sauvage, I think are dead even for me. So there you have it. That's my final Gojira album ranking. In A+, we have Magma, my absolute favorite. In A, we have L'Enfant Sauvage and Fortitude. In B, so right in the middle, we have From Mars to Sirius, and we have Terra Incognita. And then in C, we have The Way of All Flesh. And then in D, we just have The Link. Alright, so that is going to wrap up my Gojira album ranking. I loved doing this video. I'm so glad I got into Gojira's music. I think they're a fantastic band. They're definitely a great gateway band into metal music, and they just fuse like natural earthy elements with intense instrumentals and vocals, and they make these harmonies and tracks that are just beautiful. They make metal music very palatable, and for people like me who are new to that genre, I think they're a great starting point. But yeah, thank you all for voting in that poll that I put on YouTube. Like I said, Gojira was ranked number 1, so I went ahead and did a Gojira album ranking, and hopefully you all enjoyed this video. And let me know in the comments what your favorite Gojira album is, and if you agree or disagree with me. But yeah, thank you all so much for watching. Stay tuned, and I will see you in the next video.